South Korea's students study 16 hours a day to pass a single exam. Japan's bureaucrats work themselves to death, literally. And there's even a word for it, karoshi. Singapore executes people for drug possession and consistently ranks among the world's happiest, most orderly societies. China builds infrastructure at a scale that defies Western political logic. And in every case, Western analysts reach for the same explanations: authoritarianism, culture, economic pragmatism. They're not wrong, but they're not seeing the root. These aren't separate national peculiarities. They're the same philosophy expressed in 4 different accents across 4 different centuries of adaptation. A philosophy formulated by one man in one failing state during one of history's most violent periods, and it outlasted every empire, every dynasty, every revolution that tried to replace it. This is the story of Confucianism, not the textbook version, not the temple incense and ceremonial robes version. The living, governing, policy-shaping version that still sits at the center of East Asian political life and explains behavior that the rest of the world keeps misreading. 2,500 years ago, a minor government official from the state of Lu watched his civilization collapse into war, corruption, and chaos. He spent decades traveling from court to court, trying to convince rulers to govern differently. Almost none of them listened. He died believing he had failed. And then, 2 centuries after his death, an emperor built an entire civilization on his ideas. That official was Kong Chu, known to history as Confucius. And what he proposed wasn't a religion, though it absorbed religious functions. It wasn't a legal code, though it shaped law for millennia. It was something more fundamental, a theory of social order. A blueprint for how human beings should organize themselves, so that civilization doesn't collapse. The conventional understanding of Confucianism stops at filial piety and ancestor worship. Respect your parents, honor your elders, practice ritual. That's the surface layer, important but incomplete. What's underneath is a comprehensive theory of governance, legitimacy, and social contract that has proven more durable than any empire it was ever attached to. Most people think Confucianism is a relic, something modern East Asian governments pay lip service to while operating on entirely different principles. What they miss is that Confucianism never required a Confucian state to survive. It survived inside families, inside bureaucracies, inside education systems, inside the basic assumptions people hold about what authority means and what they owe each other. By the time any government decided to reject it, Confucianism had already become the operating system that government was running on. We're going to examine 4 mechanisms, 4 ways Confucian ideas translated from ancient philosophy into modern governance. And by the end, you'll understand why these societies behave the way they do, not as a mystery, but as a logical outcome of ideas that are still very much alive. The first mechanism is hierarchy, and it's more radical than it sounds. Confucius didn't just accept hierarchy as a fact of life. He made it a moral principle. He identified 5 fundamental relationships that structure all of human society: ruler and subject, father and son, husband and wife, elder brother and younger brother, friend and friend. Notice something. 4 of those 5 are explicitly unequal, and Confucius argued that those inequalities weren't just inevitable. They were good. They were the source of order. A society where everyone knew their place and fulfilled the duties that came with that place would be stable, harmonious, and prosperous. Now, that sounds uncomfortable to modern Western ears, but here's the crucial part that usually gets left out. The hierarchy was mutual. The ruler owed the subject benevolent governance. The father owed the son protection and guidance. The elder owed the younger mentorship. Hierarchy without reciprocal duty wasn't Confucian. It was tyranny, and Confucius explicitly condemned it. The Han Dynasty, which consolidated China around 200 BCE, institutionalized this framework into governance. Confucian scholars became the administrative class. The emperor ruled not by raw power, but by moral example, a concept called di, or virtue. The state wasn't just a power structure, it was a moral community with ethical obligations running in every direction. Fast forward to today. Japan's corporate culture, the seniority system, the deference to superiors, the expectation that group consensus precedes individual initiative, is Confucian hierarchy adapted to the corporate structure. In South Korea, the chaebols, the massive family-owned conglomerates like Samsung and Hyundai, operate on explicitly hierarchical, patriarch-centered models. Singapore's People's Action Party has governed continuously since 1959, justifying stability through order rather than adversarial democracy. and routinely invokes Asian values, a term that political scientists have identified as essentially a modernized Confucian hierarchy argument. These aren't governments pretending to be Confucian. They're governments that emerged from societies where hierarchy as a moral framework never left. The form changed, the assumption didn't. The second mechanism is meritocracy, and this one created something genuinely extraordinary. One of Confucius's most subversive ideas in his own time was this: virtue and competence, not birth, should determine who governs. In a world of hereditary aristocracy, this was radical. If anyone, regardless of family, could cultivate virtue and demonstrate knowledge, then the best should govern, not the most powerful bloodlines. This idea became institutionalized as the imperial examination system, the Keiju, which China developed into a rigorous, multi-tiered national test that determined entry into government service. By the Tang dynasty, around the 7th century CE, the exams had become the primary pathway to political power. Candidates could spend decades studying classical Confucian texts, competing through local, provincial, and national examinations, with the final level personally overseen by the emperor. The pass rate at the highest level was sometimes under 1%. Think about what this created: a governing class selected not by military power or noble birth, but by demonstrated mastery of a shared intellectual tradition. A meritocracy, imperfect certainly, and often gamed by those with resources to afford years of study. But a meritocracy nonetheless, stretching across 1,300 years of Chinese history, until the system was abolished in 1905. Its psychological legacy is everywhere. South Korea's university entrance exam, the Sunyoung, determines life trajectory with a finality that Western educators find shocking. One test, one day, shaping what you become. In China, the Gaokao performs the same function for hundreds of millions of families. Japan's elite university pipeline feeds directly into government and corporate hierarchies. Singapore's civil service is famously selective and lavishly compensated, designed to attract the best minds into public administration, a conscious revival of the Confucian Mandarin ideal. The educational obsession across East Asia, the cram schools, the tutoring industries worth billions, the 16-hour study days, isn't just economic anxiety. It's the Keiju reborn. The belief, deep in the cultural bedrock, that the examination is the legitimate measure of a person's worth and their right to status. Confucius said virtue could be cultivated through study. East Asian societies heard, pass the test, and you have proven your virtue. That equation has never really been challenged. The third mechanism is harmony. And this is where philosophy becomes politics, and sometimes something more coercive. Confucius was not a peaceful idealist in the naive sense. He understood that social harmony required structure, and that structure required enforcement. What he argued was that the goal of governance was not freedom, not individual rights in the Western sense, but harmony. A state of social equilibrium where relationships functioned as they should, conflict was minimized, and collective well-being prevailed over individual assertion. The philosophical heir to this idea in East Asian governance is what scholars call the harmony imperative, the consistent prioritization of social stability over individual expression. In Confucian thought, the person who disrupts social harmony, even in pursuit of justice, bears some moral responsibility for the disruption itself. The whistleblower, the protester, the dissenter, these figures have a fundamentally different moral valence in a Confucian framework than in a rights-based liberal framework. This is not a small distinction. It explains why Chinese governance consistently frames control over speech and assembly as social protection rather than repression. The official justification for restricting protests isn't "we fear opposition." It's "these activities threaten stability, and stability is a collective good everyone benefits from." That's not just propaganda, though it functions as propaganda. It's a Confucian argument, recognizable to anyone familiar with the tradition. Japan's culture of public conformity, the social pressure against standing out, the tendency to absorb individual grievance rather than express it, reflects a Confucian harmony sensibility adapted to a democratic system. Singapore's government has been explicit about this, arguing that Asian societies prioritize community over individual, and that Western-style adversarial democracy is a poor fit for Confucian societies where consensus is the goal. Here's where we have to add complexity. Every political tradition can be used to serve power. The harmony imperative, which began as a genuine moral philosophy about human relationships, has been adapted, critics would say weaponized, by states seeking to justify centralized control. The question historians and political scientists debate is whether this represents Confucianism as designed or Confucianism as exploited. Confucius himself condemned unjust rulers. The tradition is more complex than any single government's use of it, but the language of harmony, stability, and collective good remains one of the most powerful tools in East Asian political rhetoric precisely because it taps genuine cultural intuitions formed over centuries. The fourth mechanism is the benevolent authority bargain, and this one might be the most consequential for the 21st century. At the core of Confucian political thought is an implicit contract between ruler and ruled that differs fundamentally from Western social contract theory. In Locke, Rousseau, and the liberal tradition, the legitimacy of government derives from the consent of the governed, expressed through representative institutions. Challenge those institutions, and you challenge tyranny. In the Confucian framework, legitimacy derives from performance. The ruler, or the state, earns the right to govern by actually governing well, ensuring food, order, security, and prosperity. The mandate of heaven, the Tianming, was the Chinese articulation of this idea. Rulers govern with divine sanction only as long as they fulfill their obligations to the people. Natural disasters, famines, and rebellions were read as signs that the mandate had been withdrawn. A ruler who governed badly had, by definition, lost his right to rule. This is not authoritarianism without accountability. It is accountability of a different kind, outcome-based rather than process-based. Not did you follow democratic procedures, but did your governance produce results? This framework maps with striking precision onto how the Chinese Communist Party justifies its rule today. The CCP doesn't claim democratic legitimacy. It claims performance legitimacy. We lifted 800 million people out of poverty. We built the world's largest infrastructure network. We restored China's power after a century of humiliation. Question our methods, but measure us by results. That argument resonates in China not because people are brainwashed, but because it aligns with a Confucian intuition about what makes authority legitimate. Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew made a nearly identical argument for decades. Competent, uncorrupted, results-delivering governance justified a restricted political space. South Korea and Japan, both functioning democracies, still maintain powerful technocratic bureaucracies whose authority derives substantially from expertise rather than electoral mandate, a modern echo of the Mandarin class. The benevolent authority bargain asks citizens to trust that the state is competent and well-intentioned. In return, the state delivers order, security, and prosperity. When states deliver, the bargain holds. When they fail, as the Qing dynasty failed, as South Korea's government failed in various corruption scandals, the mandate is contested. The form of the bargain changes. The logic doesn't. Notice the pattern that emerges across all four mechanisms: hierarchy, meritocracy, harmony, benevolent authority. They aren't four separate ideas. They're four pillars of a single architecture, and they reinforce each other. Hierarchy gives order its moral legitimacy. Meritocracy selects who exercises hierarchical authority. Harmony defines the goal that authority serves. Benevolent authority defines the terms by which rulers are judged against that goal. This is what makes Confucianism so durable. It isn't a collection of rules. It's a self-reinforcing system that, once internalized, generates its own logic at every level of society, inside families, schools, corporations, and governments simultaneously. You don't need a state enforcing Confucianism when families are already practicing it, when schools are already rewarding it, when workplaces are already organized around it. The philosophy reproduces itself through culture rather than law, which is why political revolutions haven't been able to displace it. Mao Zedong tried. He explicitly identified Confucianism as feudal backwardness, launched campaigns to destroy its influence, and during the Cultural Revolution, had temples desecrated and scholars persecuted. The People's Republic spent decades attempting to replace Confucian social logic with Marxist class logic. And then, in 2014, Xi Jinping stood in Khufu, Confucius's birthplace, and delivered a speech declaring Confucianism central to Chinese civilization and the spiritual foundation of Chinese governance. The revolution had failed to dislodge what was already inside the walls. Japan's Meiji modernizers tried a different approach. They selectively retained Confucian hierarchy and loyalty while grafting Western technology and institutional forms onto it. The result was a society that industrialized at unprecedented speed while maintaining social cohesion structures that Western observers kept misreading as primitive. They weren't primitive, they were efficient, just organized around different values. What this teaches us is that political philosophy isn't just what governments declare, it's what populations assume. It's the background noise of social expectation that shapes what people demand from authority, what they accept from it, and what they refuse. Confucianism survived not because any state protected it, but because it embedded itself in the daily texture of relationships. In how a son speaks to a father, how a student addresses a teacher, how a junior employee defers to a senior. Philosophy that lives in behavior is almost impossible to legislate away. The complication worth sitting with is this. Confucianism contains genuine wisdom about human relationships, collective responsibility, and the duties that come with power. It also contains frameworks that can be adapted, selectively, conveniently, to justify arrangements that serve power more than people. The same tradition that insists rulers must be virtuous also conditions subjects to defer. The same philosophy that prizes merit also created examination systems so grueling they consumed human lives. Every great tradition contains this tension. The question is always who controls the interpretation and in whose interest. The question isn't whether Confucianism shaped East Asia. That argument is settled by every education ministry, every corporate hierarchy, every government press release invoking social harmony in 4 different languages across the Pacific Rim. The question that genuinely remains open is more interesting. Can a Confucian society build liberal democratic institutions that feel legitimate from within, rather than imported from without? South Korea and Japan are the current experiments. Taiwan is another. Their answers matter beyond East Asia. And there's a mirror question worth asking from the other direction. As Western liberal democracies struggle with polarization, institutional decay, the collapse of trust in experts and governments, is there something the Confucian tradition understands about social cohesion that purely rights-based frameworks have lost? Not as a model to copy, but as a provocation. Confucius died convinced his idea, as had failed. He never knew that 2,000 years later, a civilization of more than 1 billion people would organize itself around his answer to one question: how do human beings live together without destroying each other? He didn't get the last word. He got every word after. Whether that's a triumph or a cautionary tale might depend entirely on which part of the tradition does the governing and which part gets buried. That's not a question history has answered. It's a question East Asia is still living. What do you think? Can ancient philosophy and modern democracy coexist, or does one eventually have to give way?